And there's Matthieu. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I feel much better now that we figured this part out.
That's great. Wonderful.
So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the first Instagram Live of the Winemakers Research Exchange. If I don't know you, my name is Joy, and I am the Research Analyst and Extension Coordinator for the WRE, and I am thrilled to have Matthieu Finot joining me today. Matthieu is the winemaker for King Family Vineyards, and we are here today to talk about whole cluster fermentation. Before we jump in, just to give you like a quick overview of the WRE, if you've just come across our work and you don't know what we do, we are the Winemakers Research Exchange, a non-profit organization of winemakers based out of Virginia. We're funded by the Virginia Wine Board, and our purpose is to promote innovation through experimentation and education in the wine industry. And basically what that means is that we do practical level experiments in wineries each year, like the one that we're going to be talking about today. So if you have more questions about what we do, or if you want to see examples of that, you can always go to our website, winemakersresearchexchange.com, and see a whole bunch of experiments. If you just hit the search button or the our studies button, then you can see all of the experiments that have been done over the last 6 years. So Matthieu, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about whole clusters.
Thank you for having me. So
I thought we would start. When I started looking at this, I kind of looked back at the WRE website to look at how many whole cluster experiments we've had. Do you have any idea how many have been done through the WRE in our 6 years?
I don't know. Maybe I've tried to do one at least every year. No.
Well, there have been 15 total. And
okay.
You have 3 of the reports are yours, although I know that you've done more experiments than that
yes.
have gotten to full reports. So clearly whole cluster fermentation is something that you think about a lot, that you like to experiment with. So I thought maybe we would start just by talking about what your interest is in this particular approach, what you like about whole cluster fermentations, and also sort of what you keep experimenting with. Why are you still experimenting? What have you not figured out yet?
Because I'm not sure I did find exactly the proper way to doing it, but that's why am I doing that? I think initially it started with Capfran. I mean, like the spark was with Capfran. I do love Capfran, and I love working with Capfran. And despite some people that try to hide the methoxypyrrozine, I was trying to bring a little bit, maybe not methoxypyrrozine, but I was trying to bring a little bit more herbaceousness in my Cabernet Franc, because, you know, we're on a fairly ripe razor here. So we got flavors that have a profile that is very often could be perceived as, you know, ripe. And I wanted to bring a bit more of the vegetal character of the Cabernet Franc into my wine. And so my quest to that led me initially to be like, oh, how about like I'm trying to bring some stem in the fermentation. Also, I've been, you know, as being a kind of a old world techniques initially, and I wanted to explore that a bit more and to get back to, you know, even if sometimes our profile is right, I sometimes feel also that my wine could use a little bit more of tannin, of in some way harshness, and sometimes I want my wine to be a bit more rustic, and so I wanted to explore where I could go with the whole cluster fermentation. So my goal personally was never to do a carbonic maceration. So, you know, I just want to make that clear. I'm not trying to do a carbonic maceration here. I was really trying to, my inspiration personally was, if you know a little bit about Northern Rhone, where I'm from, we've got two wines, two of the cru. One is Hermitage, and the other one is Cornas. So Cornas is a bit less known than Hermitage, but Cornas traditionally has got this reputation to be like very rustic Syrah. But the reason why they were like that too is because they were very often made with whole cluster fermentation, not in a carbonic way. So, and Hermitage was always more feminine, more polished, more subtle, and Cornas was a bit more rustic. So that was my initial inspiration, and that leads me to try to make this wine. So.
Okay. Okay.
And once you try one, after you want to try with Merlot, and then after with Petit Verdot, and see where it goes. So
once we talk about the experiment itself, we'll circle back to the differences that you found in the varieties. But I'd love to just jump into kind of how you approached this. So I thought maybe we would talk just a little bit about the protocol that you used. When you and I first talked about this, there were certain things you were very clear about, like, I do it this way because I have this purpose for it. So I thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about how you set up your whole cluster ferment and why you did certain steps that you did. So for example, you started with warm grapes. So
yes.
you picked them and you didn't chill them overnight. You put
Yes.
them right into the bin. So you want to talk to us a little bit about why you took that approach?
Because I've succeeded to have a lot of failure. So failure
you learn
is
from your
why.
experience.
Trial and error, that's what we call. So one of the issue with all cluster fermentation is, especially with the volume that I'm working with. So far, I haven't started to do whole cluster fermentation in a whole tank. I'm always doing it in fermentation bins. So fermentation bins, it's 1 ton worth of fruit. Working with such small quantity, you don't have the natural compaction that you will get with the weight of a big tank. So the juice extraction naturally is very, very low. If I cool down my grapes, not only I feel like the berries are a little bit harder to break down when they are colder. I'm not sure if there's any scientific reasoning behind that, but I just feel like they break down less easily when they are cold. I'm not a scientist.
You got that one right scientifically, though.
And also what happened is in my first experimentation, I've noticed very often at the beginning, I had acetate being created very, very quickly by yeast. I mean, obviously not the Saccharomyces, but some yeast and some bacteria. So I had this kind of like very, wine that I started very strongly on acetate. And for me, one of the reasons is because not only either the fermentation was making too much time to start and then produce some CO2 to protect the batch, or the other reason is I didn't have enough juice to really sustain the fermentation and to produce. So it's either I didn't have enough juice or I didn't have enough CO2, or so I realized that the best way to start a fermentation is to be sure that you have you don't start with a must that is at 40 Fahrenheit degrees, but if you start a must that is at 60, 68, you know that the fermentation is going to have no time to start. You're going to create carbon dioxide right away, and carbon dioxide, for me, is really what's going to protect, especially onto an open top fermentation, will protect your berries and your clusters.
Right. So really, you're trying to get the fermentation going fast so you can make CO2, displace the oxygen, and keep the non-Saccharomyces yeast, like the cloacra, from giving you ethyl acetate and acetic acid. That makes a lot of sense. So when you're dumping,
I've heard. What I was saying is I've heard people using CO2. I mean, like dry ice or anything like that to saturate with the must with carbon dioxide. And I tried to do it in the past, but I never was successful. It will either for me getting back there and putting dry ice every hour to be sure that I keep my must protected. I never really was successful with the dry addition. I don't have a lid that is completely sealed. So I feel like the only way for me to protect my must is really having a fermentation going.
Okay. Yeah, so that's a good point. So some other people approach this with displacing that oxygen with dry ice. Which really shifts the temperature profile. So I think that would be an experiment later on too, is to do it with both temperature changes, because I think it would really change the outcome of what's happening inside the grape berry at that time. Okay, so you're dumping the clusters into the bin.
Yes.
What's happening as it goes into the bin?
So again, like for me, even if I want to keep some of the whole berries and the whole cluster, I also want to have some juice that could start a fermentation and ferment for long enough. Especially when I've done it with Cabernet Franc, I didn't see the same result with Petit Verdot and Merlot, but Cabernet Franc's got a very thick skin.
Yep.
And Cabernet Franc, if you don't crush the grapes at some point, I mean, I've tried it 1 year, like for almost 1 week, like I had no breakage of berries for almost 1 week. So what I'm doing now is I'm filling up 1/3, I will say a quarter, 1/3 of the bean with my cluster, and then I love Lucy style punching. So we go into the tank, we do a fit. I don't know what you call that, but you know, we go. We stomp it barefoot. Yes, just to be sure that we smash a part of the berry that will create enough juice for me to start my fermentation and to protect the rest of the cluster that I will put on top.
So you're basically stomping just enough to get enough juice to get a fermentation going. You're not trying to like really crush those berries too much, but just get enough juice to get some yeast going.
On the 1/3, the first 1/3 is pretty destroyed by then when I'm done stomping it. I mean, it's you know, I do the best that I can, but it's I'm trying to get juice because everything that
you're not being gentle about it. You're really you have like 1/3 stomped and then the rest of it whole cluster. Okay.
Yes.
And then you add yeast at that point. So you kind of inoculate at that point.
So as soon as I'm done with my stomping, especially later on, also I've been working more about natural yeast fermentation. So I've got a starter that I start 3, 4, 5 days, depending on my timing, in the vineyard before we harvest the grapes. So when we harvest the grapes, I've got a starter that is fully going from the vineyard. So use just a bucket, a 6-gallon bucket that I'm going to dump on top of my stomped juice. And then after I can come and get my other clusters on top of this starter.
Okay. And then so once you get that going, how long does it so what does your cap management look like in sort of the first couple of days? First of all, how long does it take before you actually get a cap? And you know, what are you doing in the midst? Are you sealing it off, or are you
I just have a natural a closed, breathable closed T-bean cover. I don't have any shrink wrap or anything like that.
You're not trying to seal it off in some way.
No. As long as if it's fermented, the CO2 is going to keep going back up. So for me, I feel like having the CO2 going up and keep producing CO2 is the best way to protect your fruit than trying to put some CO2 on top and hoping that it's going to go down. So I feel like for me, the fermentation from the bottom is the best way to get it to going up. What I'm doing
I've tried it the other way and it doesn't work.
So, but again, I'm not really trying to do a carbonic maceration. My cap management is still like twice a day, at least for the 2-3 first days. I'm going to be going and doing a stomping on the whole T-beans. Again, that might seem weird, and I had this conversation with people that never done it, but you can try to do it with boots and everything, but still the best way to do it is get in shorts and barefoot and get in there. There's something about feeling the grapes, and you can't go through the cap. It's very solid. I mean, you know, I have to jump on it sometimes to be able to get through initially. And then as it starts fermenting, then you start having this kind of it starts going up, and after 2 or 3 days, I can just do a regular punch down. But the first 2, and it depends on the varietal. Cab Franc might take a little bit longer before I can start doing a punch down. Petit Verdot gets smashed very, very quickly. So I don't need to work as hard on the Petit Verdot.
Yeah, you know, I've done this on Cab Franc, and it is like you can't punch it down for the first couple of days. There's just too much resistance in there.
Yeah, so you physically have to do it yourself. Yes. Right.
Okay. So before we kind of go any further, so this particular experiment, you had one T-bean that was 100% destemmed. You had one T-bean that was like 50-50. So
Yes.
50% destemmed and then 50% whole cluster. And then you had a third T-bin that was 100% whole cluster.
Yes.
So do you want to talk just a second about your 50-50? Like how did, like I've read things where people put all the grapes in, or the whole clusters first and destem on top, or the other way. What was your technique for that?
Yeah, I mean, very often you've got people talking about the lasagna effect or whatever you want to call it, but like having layers of like whole cluster, destem, whole cluster, destem. I think that will make sense if you are doing it in a tank, but for such a small volume for 1 ton fermenters, while we were having the destemmer feeding the T-bin, at the same time we were dumping whole cluster lugs into it. So it was, as we were going, it was mixed as we were going.
Okay. And then when did you end up pressing? So like you do this, you get to the cap, you start doing punch downs. How did you decide when to press? Was it dryness? Was it?
It was a little bit linked to in fact my destem batch, because I was trying. It takes longer for the whole cluster to ferment. And the reason why is because as you go, you're gonna break down more berries, you're gonna realize more sugar, so your fermentation is dragged much longer. But on my control, that was a destem vat. Once the fermentation is done, especially on small T-bins, the cap's gonna fall down. And for me, as soon as the cap fall down, I consider that I don't have any production of carbon dioxide in my wine, meaning my wine is no longer protected. And if I don't want it to turn to vinegar, it's better if I press it then. So, so my pressing time for this trial was linked to when my control was done fermenting. Also, with trial and error about pressing the whole cluster, that could be another time where you can have a problem, because when especially if you do a very long extended maceration on a whole cluster, what could happen is, and it did happen to me, so I'm just like, it's just not theoretically.
Go ahead and explain it. Yeah, I know
it is very real. Your juice in the fermenters is dry, and you've been letting it sit for a little bit longer, and it's almost done with malolactic fermentation, and then you press it, and then you release some very nice sugar of the whole berries that haven't exploded during the punch downs. And this sugar that you release then is food for everything. It's food for bread, it's food for bacteria. So usually what you end up having is like your VA going up and your bread going up. So that's not two things that are really looking into my wine. So I did that to adapt a little bit to be more proactive into protecting the wine at pressing, to be sure that everything goes fine.
Yeah. Some of the things that I read prior to this would talk about how by the time you press, you have this really healthy yeast population. So it goes really fast through the fermentation at the end. But if you've started any malolactic in the like,
yes,
like the alcoholic fermentation piece, then some people will actually separate those out so that your free run is separate from your pressed juice. But when you're just doing T-bin, you can't really do that so much. So, but that's definitely something to look out for. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the chemistry results and taste some wines together, unless there's anything else about the methodology that you feel like we really need to go over before we talk.
Yes. One of the challenge about the fermentation is at the beginning. If you are let's say you use sulfur at crush, it works very well on a destem or partially destem wine, because then you've got some juice, and then your sulfur will be active on the juice that you're going to be using then. But if you use the same amount of sulfur that you will do, let's say you use like even a very low rate at 20 ppm, if you add 20 ppm of sulfur on a non-destem wine, you're adding just like pure 20 ppm of sulfur at the bottom of your T-bin, and that will even delay even more your start of fermentation, because you're not going to have anything to dilute this sulfur dioxide into the. So that's also something that I've changed. Now I'm not using any sulfur anymore with this batch. I'm protecting it with some chitosan, but I'm not using sulfur at crush for the whole cluster because otherwise it's too. There's too much sulfur for the juice that you will start fermenting with.
Right. Okay, good. And you actually, that right as you started talking about that, somebody asked that question. So perfect timing there.
I don't see any questions. So like, you're gonna have to tell me what people are asking.
I can barely, I have old lady eyes, so I can barely see what it says, but I'm trying to keep track of the things that are coming in. So thanks to everybody who's joined us. Before we move on and talk about chemistry, in case you joined us in the last couple of minutes, just to recap, I'm Joy from the WRE, and I'm talking to Matthieu Finot from King Family Vineyards about a whole cluster fermentation experiment that he did in Petit Verdot. So we're about to go ahead. And
so I've got a question. I'm gonna answer because somebody just asked. I think it's probably Tim Gorman. Tim Gorman is asking me how about to spot some CO2 from the bottom. Yes, I could do that, but at the same time, if I can get the yeast producing the CO2 for me, not only I'm saving time, but I'm also saving money by not buying canisters of CO2 that the yeast is going to produce no matter what. So.
Well, I think and that's a great point. And I think the other tricky thing there is about knowing how much CO2 you actually have to put in there. The studies will show that when you first start doing this, the grapes actually absorbed a bunch of CO2. So you end up having to put in a lot more CO2 than most of us are used to putting in there. Like our little sparge that we usually do is not nearly enough to really displace all that oxygen. So
I mean, I tried to have a tube. I tried to have a tube going into the bin with like holes where I was dropping dry ice to try to get in the bottom, but you don't cover as much. Like the sulfur is still not gonna. The carbon dioxide still not gonna go everywhere, and you're always gonna have pockets that's gonna start weird things going on. So
your preference is definitely to do that yeast fermentation, and again to sort of take in doing that you get a little bit warmer temperature. It goes a little bit faster, so you don't have as much time of those whole berries. But for you, your point really it sounded like was to get sort of the rustic nature of the stems and that sort of thing. So having those whole berries that whole time is not your first priority in doing it either. So,
but trust me, I still have a lot of whole berries when I press. When I press my wine, there's still a lot of whole berries. So I'm not worried too much about that.
Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at your chemistry real quick. I sent you this to you by email probably this morning. And those of you that are following along, if you want to know the raw numbers for these are all posted on the WRE website, which is winemakersresearchexchange.com. It's all one big word. And if you go on the front page, there's a little link to click. But we'll just talk through the sort of the more important points of the chemistry here. So when we look at it, it looks like you were very successful in controlling the volatile acidity in the sense that your VA numbers are pretty much the same for all three lots. And so in this case, I think it looks like that approach of kind of displacing with CO2 seemed to be a pretty good approach. I was really interested to see that your pH numbers are about the same.
But you still have a small difference. You still have a small difference between the whole cluster. Not very much.
So normally we would expect the pH to be a little bit higher in the one that has the stems because our stems will give off some potassium, which will bind to some tartaric acid and give us a little bit higher pH. I was wondering in this case, because Petit Verdot has so much potassium in the skins anyways, if we just sort of are flooding it with all those skins, those extra stems just don't even make a difference.
Yeah, I think my pH is so bad to start with. It's so terrible that it's not going to
Petit Verdot is just not the thing that we worry about. And then I thought the other interesting thing was that your alcohol was about 0.5% lower in the 100% whole cluster than it was in the other two.
And I did notice that on very often. That's what I've noticed. Like the whole cluster fermentations got a slightly lower ABV.
So there are some things in the literature that we'll talk about. You know, inside of the grape, when you have that whole berry, when it starts to do its sort of internal alcoholic fermentation, there is some thought that those enzymes are less efficient at converting the sugar to alcohol. And so sometimes you can have a little bit lower conversion rate. So that makes sense with what we might expect from that situation, from those whole berries. So So somebody's asking, would the stem lignification or ripeness affect pH rise? That's a really good question about whether the lignification of the stems, we know that affects the flavor and the pyrazine, but I don't know if it actually affects the potassium coming off the skin or the stems. Do you happen to know that too?
No. Now,
Okay.
one of the common questions that I've got with whole berry fermentation, whole cluster fermentation, is a lot of time people asking me, "Oh, do you wait for your stem to be brown or lignified?"
To be brown, yeah.
I mean, I've you know, Cap France
You'd
got
have
a
to wait till
tendency.
you move to a different region, right?
Yes, maybe if I go to California, I'll be able to see that. But no,
Yeah.
what I'm saying is Cap France got some stems that's got a tendency to be browner, a little bit more lignified.
Yeah.
But like Petit Verdot, like I never seen like bronze stem on Petit Verdot, even when it's very, very ripe. So I'm not worried about being lignified or not. For me, it's again, even when I was working with Syrah in the Northern Rhone, you know, the stem are green, and that's what we're using. So it's not. I'm not worried too much about that.
I would agree. I think you can't, if you want to use whole clusters, you can't wait for brown stems in Virginia. It's very, very rare. So, so let's keep looking at your color or your chemistry real quick, and then we'll taste the wines, because I think there's some really interesting things in the sensory on this one.
There were a question that we missed earlier, and I think it's important because we've talked about the problem of having sugar after pressing. And one of the questions, I think it's Rick Tag that was asking, how do I deal with the sugar once I've pressed my wine? Again, I'm using chitosan. What I've noticed is when you press, if you use chitosan, then you're going to inhibit not only the Brettanomyces that could feed with the sugar that you extracted, but it's also going to inhibit the bacteria, the malolactic bacteria. So using chitosan at this time really, for me, really helped to keep a clean profile into the wine and not having some deviation at the time of pressing.
So when you add the chitosan and you take out the malolactic bacteria, do you have problems getting malic to start later on? So you don't usually inoculate for malic. So
no, I don't inoculate, and usually I just do a rack and return, and just a rack and return by removing the chitosan that's been adding, and after usually it's enough for the wine to finish.
So you feel like there's just enough resin in the cellar that it can still kick off?
Yes.
So we did see just a little bit of a color loss, and so what we also picked out with whole clusters. So your D-stem had higher color than your whole cluster did, but Petit Verdot has so much color anyways. The question is, does that matter? So, you know, I guess my question for you is, do you notice a difference when you look at those? While you're looking at them, I'm going to try to hold them up so that our viewers can see.
I don't see any difference.
Yeah, I was going to say this is the traditional maceration one, and this is my 100%. So I don't see that. I mean, we can see the number there, but it doesn't seem like it's causing a big, like, perceptible difference here.
I mean, if I look at it, I will see a difference. Like when I look at both glass side by side, I'll see a difference. Do I care about it? Absolutely not. I mean, for me, color is not important. It doesn't participate to the taste. It doesn't participate to how the wine is. It's just a visual aspect of it. If I've got the structure that, and again, I've got more structure, I've got more tannin on the one that is lighter in color. So for me, color is not, I don't care about color. Like ultimately in 10 years, if I drink this wine in 10 years, I would not care about the color. So I should not.
To me, it reminds me of like the Nebbiolo situation, right? Like Nebbiolo oftentimes has very, very light color, but it has very strong structure. And so, but in this case, I don't think it even really matters.
No, it's not even close
like
from a
Nebbiolo. And so then when we look at the other phenolics, it does look like you do have lower anthocyanins, which goes along with the color difference there. It looks like the tannins are about the same for all three of them, but you do have an increase in catechin, which is one of your phenolics that comes from the stems on your, like, the more stem you had, the more catechin you had. But the thing that's striking to me is actually the sensory on these. So it feels to me like even though the numbers look a lot the same, that like the the sensory of the tannin is a little bit different. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about what these taste like to you.
I mean, for me, the tannin from the stem are, I mean, just bite into the stem and you'll see this kind of like very edgy and square tannin.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got the round tannin, you've got the small silky tannin, and that's like, it's a cube. So that's a bit what I've got. Is I've got the roughness, some roughness that come with these tannins that I do like. I mean, it's maybe not like, very approachable, but I'm also not doing a wine that I want to sell now. It's a wine that's designed to age, and I think this kind of like roughness is going to help the evolution of the wine.
So when I tasted these right before we came on, I feel like the destem to me tastes like a very like typical Petit Verdot in the sense that it's kind of got that brooding fruit to it. It certainly has structure to it, but it's not like super grippy. And then the 100% has this like just bright freshness at the top that I don't usually get with Petit Verdot. And I think that's where your whole berries are coming in to give you some of that bright freshness. And then just like you were saying, I feel like the tannin astringency is just, it is more, it's a more grippy and more angular, and almost greenish, but again, in my experience, and I would suspect you have a lot to say about this too, that these tannins are kind of, with whole clusters, I feel like in the first year, the tannins are like kind of rough. And then like after 2 or 3 years, they just sort of come together to give you this really nice structure.
So that's one thing is like when you press your whole cluster, not only it's going to start re-fermenting after in the barrel, so it's going to take time for the wine to settle down. And so when you taste it during the winter, it is a very, very weird wine. Like the first years that I was doing it, every time in the winter, I'm like, wow, what am I going to do with that? It was rough, not together. A lot of bitterness. Very often when it's young, you got a lot of bitterness coming out of the stem.
I think there's a little bitterness.
There's still some bitterness, but then after 2 years, because usually I try to age them for like 1.5 years, 2 years, depending on the vintage. But after 2 years in barrel, suddenly like this kind of like roughness almost leaves the fruit later on and makes something like much more rounder, and it's very, very interesting. I mean, I always get initially, and we don't feel it as much on Petit Verdot because there's already a lot of what I call the white pepper character. I think that's really what the stems bring me very often is kind of like white pepper, and for me it's I really like it. I don't feel it as much on Petit Verdot because it's naturally there, but on Cab Franc and Merlot, I really bring back this spiciness that's not there initially. That's going to fade away a little bit with time, and later on leave the fruit. So.
Yeah, there's a particular chemical that they find with sort of the internal maceration of the berries. It's almost a cinnamon-like kind of ester, and it sort of goes away later on, but early on, and with like true carbonic maceration, when you're doing the internal thing, you're pressing them before the berries really break down. It's one of the like characteristic flavors that you get. Here, I think it's there, but as I agree, I think that those tend to settle down over time. We had 2 questions that came through. One of them, Tim Gorman asked the rate of ketosan that you're using when you do that sort of, post pressing, at that sort of pre-malolactic step. Is it the full rate, or do you use like a lower rate?
I will say it will depend of how much sugar I've got left. Do I think that my wine already started malolactic fermentation or not? So I will adjust, but very often it's never the full rate. Like if it's a normal wine, I will go like 2 to 3 grams per hectoliters. If for this one, usually when I do it, I go more 10 grams. Usually the recommended rate is 20 or 25 grams. Yeah. If I feel that the wine is not going into the right direction, so yes, I will go higher in quantities. But with this one, I'm not sure on top of my head how much I've used, but I think I probably used like I'm not sure exactly how much I use on this one too. I don't have my note in front of me, so, but I don't think I've used too much on this one.
So when you press this, do you remember, like, did you have noticeable bricks when you pressed it, or was it like not all the way dry? Like,
Oh, no, it wasn't dry.
It really went up by like 5 bricks, or what?
It wasn't dry. I probably had like 6 or 7 grams left to ferment, but it's not that bad. I had some Cafran where I had almost 20 grams left to ferment after pressing. So 20 grams, 2%. I mean, it's a lot of things that can go bad. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and usually it's cold by then, and all kinds of things. So one other question Rick Tag asked about, I think just a clarification question. I think you said something about pressing to barrel. When you're pressing the tank, settling, and going to barrel, correct?
Yeah, so I'm blending my press fraction and my free run wine together into one tank. I let it settle down overnight to remove like the heavy lees, and then after I get the wine into barrels. So very often the sugar is going to finish fermenting in barrels, and then once, if I feel like my wine is finished and clean and the malolactic fermentation goes without any problem, I'm going to leave it there and just add sulfur after a while. If I feel like I need to do a rack and return to help the malolactic fermentation to start, I would do a rack and return.
Good. All right. Okay, so we're kind of getting to the end of the list of questions I had for you. So as we're wrapping up here, if there's anybody that's listening that has questions, feel free to put those into the chat. But I'll ask you, Matthieu, we talked at the very beginning that you've done this on Cabernet Franc, you've done it on Merlot, you've done it on Petit Verdot. And you've talked a little bit about how Cabernet Franc just doesn't break down as much. Does
yes.
that mean you don't like to do it on Cabernet Franc, or do you just feel like you get a different effect from it?
No, in fact, I think Cabernet Franc is the one that I like to do the most. I think that's the one that I feel like, that's the one that I like the most when I do the whole cluster fermentation. My 2017 Cabernet Franc whole cluster was just like, I mean, I loved it. It was like everything, because even if I had a little bit higher VAs on my regular Cabernet Franc, because that was one of them that I didn't manage exactly the way I wanted it, it still like was tasting very, very good to me, and I really, really liked it. The Petit Verdot, if you want to play with it, I will say start with the Petit Verdot. It's like, it's easier to do. You've got less chance to get something going wrong. But again, it could be like weird to say, oh, I'm going to add tannin to a grape that is already tannic. But it's a different kind of tannin, and in some way it brings also some freshness. Again, if you plan to release it like 6 months after harvest, that's not what you want to do. But if you plan to do more than a year or 18 months aging, I think that's very interesting. If you feel that you've got grapes that are sometimes where you want to have a little bit more structure, instead of adding enological tannin, use that. That's, for me, it's another way to bring structure into the wine without using enological tannin. So I think there's value to the Petit Verdot. I like doing it with the Petit Verdot. But I think my favorite, still to that day, my favorite grapes to do is with Cab Franc.
I mean, I'm glad you did this with Petit Verdot this year, because I feel like, for me, a lot of times Petit Verdot lacks complexity, especially when it's young. Like, again, it just has this big concentrated fruit, but it doesn't really have a lot going on in the top and sort of the top part of the palate. And I feel like this brings more complexity to the game.
Yes.
And like you said, the tannin there, it's a different kind of tannin, and I'm excited to see how this will age out. So my last question for you is, this is you've got 100% Petit Verdot, the 50-50, which we didn't talk about very much, but it's sort of, to me, it's well intermediate between the two. How does this fit into like your overall Petit Verdot program? Like, does this get blended into a bigger lot? Does this get separated as a separate product?
Yeah, the 50-50 will go into a regular Petit Verdot. So that's that, and I think it's perfectly fine. The 100% old cluster, I'm going to keep it separated as a small batch, just because it's fun and I can do it. But again, I wanted to see the difference between the old cluster, the 50-50, and one thing is like, even the whole cluster could be a little bit challenging. It's a lot of things to do. It takes a lot of space. Like in one tank, I mean, you know, when you whole cluster, you're losing tank space. So sometimes you cannot afford to do that too. But I think if you, you know, if you want, you can, the 50-50 is still a good way to bring structure to your wine and to bring a bit, maybe a bit more complexity. And it's much more manageable on the winery's side of it. So you don't have to physically stump the grapes. You don't have to send your harvest intern, you know, going to stump the grapes. You can just right away start doing a pump over, and it's much, much easier to manage, and yet you still get some benefit of the whole cluster. So again, I wanted to see the difference, to see what's manageable, what's not. There's more and more batch for my regular wine where I want to start to add between 20 or 50% of whole cluster. And I know that it's manageable, and I know I can manage it without having too many surprises at the end. The 100% whole cluster, it's a slightly a different beast. You have to handle it. You have to be more careful. There's a lot of more things to look at, and you've got more chance to fail with 100%. I think like the 50-50, the 50-50 is fairly safe.
Yes, I would agree. I think we used to do a fair number of them that had, you know, lower levels of whole clusters, like 25% or 30%, and you don't have the same risk of the oxidative problems early on, but you still have that risk when you press off and have sugar come back out of it. Whereas the 100% whole cluster, yes, more risk, but potentially more reward too, and gives you a second product to kind of play. Well, I'm excited you're going to bottle it separately so we can see how it ages over time. And if anybody's out there in Instagram land that wants to be able to taste these, then you can taste them once they get bottled as well. So,
there's one thing that I want, one thing that is very important that we forget maybe to mention is when you start using whole cluster, your fruit needs to be pristine. Like your fruit needs to be very, very, very clean. Don't try to do any whole cluster with something that's like a bit of sour rot or a bit of botrytis or a little bit of this or that. You will bring so much bacteria, unwanted bacteria, and unwanted yeast that for sure will turn to vinegar very, very quickly. So you want to be sure that you've got very, very clean fruit, and spend some time sorting it, even when you dump it into your fermenters. I think that's one of the most important part is everything needs to be very, very clean.
I think you and I took that for granted, but I'm glad that you said that because it's very important. Yeah, as soon as you have any juice out there, any microbes that are on those grapes are going to start blooming, and those are not the microbes you want blooming in your whole cluster. Another thing too that a lot of the literature sources we'll talk about is just the fruit handling ahead of time. So, you know, most of us in Virginia are hand harvesting anyways, but you want to use hand harvested fruit and fruit that's not been like mushed down too much in the bins so that it started to let off. You really want intact whole clusters as you start the process for those same reasons. Yeah.
And that's also the reason why I'm processing it very, very quickly once it's harvested, to be sure that I don't let anything start growing you know, on the grapes during like a night into a chiller.
You don't want to cultivate a clockera population in your
I don't need them.
Your reaper track, right?
Okay. I don't need that to get higher VA, so it's good.
Well, this is a really great experiment, Matthieu. Thank you so much for talking with me about it today. And I will make sure to sort of have the full report up on the website as soon as I possibly can. Tim Gorman just had a question that went by really fast, and I didn't see it.
I've seen it. It's about the nutrients. I usually don't feed my yeast. I work with natural yeast. I don't care about nutrients. I don't check my yan. I just let everything happen. So it's so I'm a bad example. Don't do what I'm doing.
I would say that in some of the reading, it does talk about, again, when you have the whole grapes, part of the maceration inside the grapes that's happening when you have it going on is that it's also converting it's digesting some of the proteins from the grape cells and releasing those as amino acids. And so you actually have kind of an increase in the nutrition when you do whole berries. And so, Matthieu, I'm letting you off the hook here and not, you know, measuring and counting, because in this case you probably do have better nutrition. However, if you are coming off of a vineyard that doesn't have really good nutrition, you might want to think about that a little bit. And then citric acid is the controlled chilled, and the control in this case was not chilled, just to be able to be
I wanted to process it at the same day. I wanted them to get exactly the same time of skin contact and fermentation, so I did not chill the control.
So you can read Tim's comment.
Yeah, no, Tim's saying me lazy, but no problem. I'm proud of being lazy. You know,
is it lazy or efficient or whatever? So yeah. So anyway, we can talk about nutrition strategies on another call. So so that's all I had for today. Is there anything else in closing, Matthieu, that you'd like to close out here? Okay.
Again, don't be afraid of STEM. STEM are good. STEM are your friends.
Stems can be your friends. They're a stylistic choice, but there's a lot of good to come from that choice. So give them a try. And if you want to do an experiment, let me know. We can set up an experiment for next year. And all of this information will be on the WRE website within hopefully the next week or two, and it'll come in your email box as well. So thanks to everybody who joined us today. And again, thank you to Matthieu. It was fun to talk with you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.